We're on.
So I had mentioned 2 weeks ago that Peter and I had gone to Russia. 2006 is the date that I have on my slides. So I resurrected a couple.
Yeah,
And
there's Kat.
so this was our group. You see Doc prominently in the first photo. And that's Tatiana Umanets, who was a member of our faculty. She was born in
Scove.
Scove, right? Thank you.
Yeah, there she is. Holy crap.
And so we also have a couple other faculty members there. And
Alicia Romero.
I won't point out who it is, but there's a member of the student body there who's now a member of the CIA and a top Middle Eastern analyst. She's actually been to the White House. Having
standing next to me.
Well, I wasn't going to out her, but okay.
Oh, now she's outed. See, Valerie Plame. There we go. Okay, class dismissed.
That's why I kept it anonymous, Doc. Anyway.
Just call me Pete, right?
She's not a field operative, so it probably doesn't matter. But anyway, and that's obviously me posing with two posers of Nicholas and Lenin in front of the Kremlin there. So, but I have one other photograph. That is Peter and I enjoying some Russian vodka with members of the Russian faculty who were taking us around. So we had a good time.
We did indeed. We did indeed.
Okay, so let me move. Can't do that.
Thought that picture was of Joseph and Ivan before that.
Yeah. So orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. I spoke to this last time. Was the foundation of Mother Russia, old and new. So, and that's kind of the theme for tonight for me. One review point here. I had mentioned last time that during the Napoleonic Wars, even though the Russians were fighting Napoleon even before his invasion of Russia, they were exposed. The officer corps was exposed to the ideals of the French Revolution, and influenced them, saying, you know, why are we living in such an autocratic country at a time when other nations are enjoying at least some liberality? And again, I'm using a 19th century definition of liberal there. Here's a painting from the time period, the execution of the Decembrists. That's the Russian spelling for Decembrists. I didn't spell that. And then, just interestingly enough, a Soviet commemorative stamp of 1825. 1825 in Russian history is a big touchstone. And even Mr. Putin allows them to celebrate it. So without getting into the weeds too deep, I thought we'd get into just a little bit of Marx. And if you're going to talk Marx, then you have to really begin with Hegel, who was a German philosopher of renown and very influential upon Marx's thinking. In particular, I mean, one of his most noted points, not his only point, but was his theory of dialectics. Dialectics was a framework for understanding how ideas and reality evolve, believing that through the clash of opposing forces, a thesis and then an antithesis, a higher level of understanding or a better state of affairs would emerge, which he would call a synthesis. Now, this was on a level of thought and thinking. So the process goes, You have a thesis, an idea, and then you have an opposing idea, which emerges, the antithesis, the antithesis, which produces a synthesis of the two. And then it begins again. That synthesis is now the idea, and then another opposing idea emerges, and through that conflict, a new synthesis, and on and on and on it goes, according to Hegel. Hegel didn't see an end to that process. Marx adopted Hegel's dialectical method, viewing history as a process of development through a clash of opposing forces, but argued that material conditions and economic forces, rather than ideas or ideals, drove historical change. So it was a real evolutionary process based on Hegel's thinking, according to Marx. So, of course, Marx puts down in words in 1848 the significant Communist Manifesto, which was more a pamphlet. It really wasn't a book. His big book is, and it is a big book, is Das Kapital, which I'm not going to touch tonight. Marx was reacting to a number of forces: the class system, mercantilism and capitalism, monarchy, and religion. In his world in the mid-19th century, these were the big forces for change. And mercantilism, which is during colonial economy, where the bourgeois or the middle class are emerging to carry goods back and forth across the Atlantic and throughout Europe, emerges and develops. And of course, by the time the Industrial Revolution comes along after that, into what forms capitalism or something like that, leaving behind mercantilism, the bourgeois become, or the middle class become even more prevalent, more powerful, and richer. And obviously, Europe has many monarchs of various shapes and sizes to deal with, and then, of course, religion. Marx was a materialist. So religion was, quote, the opiate of the people. It was used by the government of various countries to control the people themselves. There is no God. That's just made up as a control factor. Marx's Hegelian dialect is the bourgeoisie would emerge, as they did under mercantilism and capitalism, to counter the monarchy. And then the proletariat would emerge because of the working class, or because of the Industrial Revolution and the people who need to work for the bourgeois, and they would emerge to counter the bourgeoisie. And this is where Marx drops the Hegelian evolutionary process, because he says, once the proletariat are there, they're going to establish dictatorship of the proletariat, and everybody's going to live happily ever after. Of course, it doesn't quite work out that way, ever. In the end, Marx was an idealist too. This history was inevitable, he thought and argued, and could not be forced. And that's the key here. It had to happen naturally. No armed revolution was going to force the change that Marx's Hegelian dialect foresaw. In other words, you couldn't make the dictator, the proletariat dictator, without the whole process first. And that's the key. But Russian Marxists had a problem: the peasants. In 1848, Russia had a population of approximately 67 million, with around 23 million serfs. Serfdom isn't ended until 1861, belonging to 103,000 landlords. Now, landlords here is broadly used. Landlords could also include peasants, free peasants, who could own some land that just happened to have serfs on it. So it wasn't just the working, or the bourgeoisie who would own peasants or serfs at that time. while a majority of the remaining population was comprised of free peasants. By 1900, total population was approximately 128 million people, and only about 4% were considered to be urban workers. Now, that's after the Industrial Revolution has really started to percolate in Russia. But of course, there's really only two urban centers in Russia at that point, Moscow and um, St. St. Petersburg, which becomes Petrograd during the revolution, and then Leningrad after Lenin establishes authority. Marxists would have a long wait for the inevitable revolt of the proletariat to over the bourgeois, and you can guess who didn't want to wait. So there's a failed assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III, who I had last time said was one of the most reactionary czars in Russian history, along with Nicholas II, who had established the whole thing of autocracy, orthodoxy, etc. It's a failed attempt. Here is a contemporary illustration of that event. Alexander Ulyanov, older brother of Lenin, was one of the conspirators who was tried and executed, resulting in Lenin adopting his brother's radical tendencies. Up to that point, he had not joined his brother. He had not been a radical. Famous portrait, everybody knows that face. So he's radicalized and gets himself into trouble promoting revolution. He's arrested in 1897 and exiled to Siberia for 3 years. Kind of sounds familiar to another person a few years later. After leaving Russia, Lenin became a leading spokesman for the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, long words for the Russian Marxist Party, in exile. Having formed a more radical faction within the Russian Marxist Party, and he calls them the Bolsheviks. Lenin forced a schism upon the party, leaving behind the Mensheviks. Now, the Mensheviks were, and I'm cutting out a lot of stuff here, but just to simplify things, the Mensheviks were arguably the true Marxists who were waiting for the proletariat to emerge in larger fashion within Russia before you're going to have a revolution. But Lenin, just look at his age, he wasn't going to live to see that revolution. So the Bolsheviks, under his leadership, developed a highly secretive, small cadre of trained revolutionaries who are going to spread sedition and revolt, while the Mensheviks stood by. So they split in 1903, actually. He briefly returned to Russia to participate in the 1905 revolution. If you've seen the movie, down in the lower left-hand corner, that's a screenshot of their portrayal of the Bloody Massacre, Bloody Sunday, the first Bloody Sunday, not the second one that's in Ireland. And it's where Father Gapon, a radical priest who is leading a group of innocent Russians to march to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to inform the Tsar that they're starving, because they just couldn't believe that he actually knew how poor their conditions were. And so it was really an information expedition, but with Nicholas's knowledge, he sends in the troops. And of course, the protesters get crushed. I threw in some art here just because I'm fascinated with Russian avant-garde art. This actually is not, but it is a little post-contemporary. It just captures kind of the flavor of the moment. This was drawn at the time. There was a thriving, small but thriving avant-garde population of artists in Russia who were very good, very successful, and they had several underground pamphlets that they ran um, with these pieces of type of art, like you see on the right, because even though the vast majority of Russians couldn't read, they could certainly understand pictures. And I think that's a particularly favorite of mine. We'll talk more about the artists in a moment. That was 1905, and of course, in 1917, the Great War, as it was known then, begins. And this is a German's rendition of what Europe looked like as war was breaking out. And it tries to capture the kind of personalities of the various countries. It's pretty clever. I included it because of this image of Russia, you know, ready to gobble up as much land as they could. Because in 1914, even the United States, who stays neutral at the time, fears the Russians, fears what their size of country and population and therefore resources could do to Europe. So there was a strong anti-Russian concern. Of course, it was grossly overestimated. Same artist drew then this one, which really captures the war itself, because what they talk about in diplomatic terms in letters and pieces is the Russian steamroller. Even though the Russian army was not well trained, even though they were ill equipped, many Russian soldiers went in with rifles but no bullets. Um, the belief was that their army was so big that they could just overrun the Austrians and the Germans. Of course, that turned out not to be true once you begin to understand the effective use of the Maxim machine gun that the Germans had, and then the long range artillery. They just um, the the steamroller was pitiful, and of course the war does not go well for the Russians, even though the
Kendall, how
expectation.
did the divisions in Russia bear in this?
Say that again. I'm sorry, Charles.
The divisions in the government, you know, the whites and the reds and the revolutions and.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet. So this is
I'm just
this
saying,
is
as the
1940.
war was being fought,
I'm sorry.
in light of World War One.
Right. So the czar is still in power, and he has his top generals, and he has three large armies. They make the mistake. Well, they make many mistakes. The Russian army. The generals don't like each other, and so they divide their forces. And you know, one major rule in military orders is you don't divide your armies. They did, and the Germans just picked them apart. But it's still Tsarist Russia in 1914. That's not going to change until 1917. So Russia's going to stay in the war and fight for 3 years, and it just further undermines the power of the Tsar and his reputation. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So the Germans know where Lenin is. He's living in exile, and they give him an armed guarded train and take him through the front and deliver him to St. Petersburg, now actually being called, Petrograd at this point. And this is not a photograph. This is just an artist rendering of it. We don't have a photograph of him. But so he is delivered to back to Russia in hopes that his arrival would destabilize Russia and force their withdrawal. Because as I said, the war does not go. I think Jenny's going to talk about the war more later. So Nicholas II was ill prepared for this moment. He was ill prepared to be czar, period. He didn't want to be czar. He was he was a 19th century man who was forced to deal with 20th century realities, and he just couldn't cope. At the same time, he had a very powerful, outspoken wife who actually provided him with backbone. Unfortunately, she had some of her own problems. So together, they were a misguided couple trying to lead Russia and not doing a very good job of it. It was 1896 when he is going to be coronated, and he still believed in his divine right. And everyone else had pretty much given up on the idea of divine right leadership at this point. He had exercised poor judgment throughout his time. And one classic example was on his day of coronation, he decided to provide free beer to anyone who showed up, which was a population that was starving, who didn't get beer, let alone safe water. So they're dispensing all these free mugs of beer. It causes a riot. At least 10,000 people were injured in the crush for free beer. Just an example of his decision making or lack thereof. He left Petrograd for the Eastern Front despite having no military training. He believed that his presence would buck up the troops, that they would fight harder because he was trying to reinstill Russian nationalism into them. It wasn't a good idea, not only because he had no clue about how to fight a war, but Rasputin enters the scene. Now, Rasputin was around before he left, but once Nicholas leaves for the front, it gives Rasputin a freer hand. And he worked his evil ways, Rasputin. And we can, there's the whole hemophiliac story of the one son and whether or not the Tsarina really was bedded by him. I've read arguments on both sides of that. It really doesn't matter. But the people believed it, and that did matter. And it just further undermines Nicholas. So they're hungry, if not starving, and there's more and more dissent. There's mutinies in the military, and there's more and more radicals showing up. So in February, the first of a two-part revolution breaks out. Food riots and a breakdown of authority led to the abdication of Nicholas II. Alexander Kerensky, who's pictured above, and who's leader of the social revolutionaries, wins the election. They do hold elections. There is a breakdown. There's about 5 or 6 political parties, but the two main ones at this point, well, there's 3. The social revolutionaries are hoping for a republic of a Russian version of a republic, if you want to call it that. There are constitutional monarchists as well. And then, of course, there are the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks who want something entirely different. Kerensky makes the fatal decision to stay in the war. There he is shaking hands of troops. And all this does is further undermine the authority of the Russian leadership, now in his hands and the social revolutionaries' hands, and plays into the hands of the Bolsheviks, who say, see, they're inept too. They're part of the bourgeoisie. You people are still hungry. You have no rights. We have to end this war. And he's going to agitate and agitate. What the Germans and to some degree the Austrians are hoping, they see an opening here in 1917 to say, okay, if we can get the Russians out of the war, then we can send all our troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and then turn the tide against the French and the English. Of course, the problem is that the United States enters the war in 1917 as well. So democracies believed 1917 would be a turning point. Of course, it was a turning point, but not the one they had hoped. I thought this was a powerful photograph that should, for at least some of you, remind you of the photographs with the fall of of East Germany and of Russia when they start tearing down all the statues,
Yep.
Which are, etched into my mind. And this certainly recalled that. The photograph on the left. Ding Darling was one of the major cartoonists of the time. He worked for, at this point, he worked for the New York Herald Tribune. And of course, it shows all this hope that the Russian people are being, unleashed and will become free. Of course, unfortunately, that's just not going to happen. So, photograph of Lenin, this actually is 1920, but I thought it illustrates what he's doing in 1917 and raising hell and building up support and undermining Kerensky's government. Lenin did not disappoint the Germans, maintaining a campaign of agitation and sedition against the Kerensky government. He demanded an immediate cessation of the war and aid to the hungry masses. His words, his battle cry: peace, land, and bread. Peace, get out of the war. Land, take the land away from the aristocracy and the middle class and redistribute that land to the people. And then, of course, get their bellies filled. It's a very powerful call. The provisional government will collapse in October because the war goes from bad to worse. So we're still got the Russian army, but now that's going to go kaput because when Lenin takes over, they're going to negotiate what becomes known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, with the Russians withdrawing their troops and actually turning over a significant piece of Eastern Europe to the Europeans, that the Soviets won't get back until the Cold War. So you have the Russian Civil War, which is all taking place during Zhivago. I thought this was an appropriate, powerful print, Russian print, just showing one little piece that they're fighting over, and it's, of course, Ukraine. Again, remember, Ukrainians are not Russians. It's the furthest thing from the truth. And the Reds are on the left, the Whites are on the right. So now we have a divided Russia. They're out of the war. The Reds is the new Red Army that's being put together by Trotsky, who was a Menshevik, but is persuaded to become part of Lenin's leadership. And without really any military experience, he's going to put together a brilliant campaign. So Trotsky is an interesting guy who doesn't get enough attention, I think, for what he tried to accomplish. Of course, he's going to end up with an ice pick in his brain, but that's another story. So world peace in Ukraine, 1919. So the Whites are anybody who didn't want the Reds. And this includes most of the significant military trained leadership from the old Russian army. but they suffer the same problems that they had when they were the Russian army. So, quick overview of the Civil War. The Civil War is most significantly fought in the European piece of Russia, but it does, extend all the way into the far east of Russia as well. And you see from this color where the three, it's really three major forces. There are a fourth of the whites, but the Reds control the railroads. And so they can move their smaller army around much more effectively. And they just outsmart the whites, who can't agree on anything because they hate each other. And then the piece that a lot of people don't really know that much about is that there was outside intervention. The Americans flirt with it, but we never really engage. But there are British, French, and American, and even Czech forces inside trying to help the whites. But of course, they're going to fail. White forces fought for absolutism, constitutional monarchy, or some form of republicanism. So they were not organized either politically or militarily from the start. So even though they had many more troops to begin with and were better armed, they were outsmarted by Lenin and Trotsky. Red forces controlled much of the key parts to Russia. The involvement of foreign armies played into the hands of red propaganda. See, if the whites win, you're going to return to what you had before, which was nothing. So support us. Trotsky, formerly a Menshevik, coordinated red forces with brutal efficiency. This is an anti-Trotsky cartoon, actually, contemporary of the time, showing him as the devil destroying all kinds of things. It's a pretty effective cartoon. Lenin instituted a policy of war communism, nationalizing industries, seizing grain from peasants, and suppressing private trade. It was brutal. I mean, he was making war on his own people as much as he was the whites in order to gain control of every aspect that he could, because he felt it was the only way he could win. So this was a nasty affair. 10 million people died during the Civil War, the majority being civilians. 2 million Russian soldiers were killed and nearly 5 million were wounded. That's the Reds looking at actually Czechs that they had killed. Millions died from famine, starvation, and epidemics, adding to the overall human cost of the conflict. Lenin scarfed up as much food as he could because he needed to feed his Red Army at the expense of the Russian peasant. Stalin's going to do the same thing. Pogroms were carried out by both sides. The Russian economy was in total shambles by the end of the Civil War in 22. So Russian avant-garde, the painters, the artists were still painting through this whole thing. There's just some amazing art where I'm interested in Russian avant-garde art. And I just pulled this one piece out. Unfortunately, it's called Beat the Whites with a Red Wedge. Unfortunately, once Stalin takes over, this would be considered bourgeois decadent art. And some of the Russian artists will get out. Many will be exiled to Siberia or murdered. And Russian avant-garde art takes a hit. But before and during the Civil War, it was a lively little population with some amazing art. So, Comrade Lenin cleanses the earth of filth as he wins the Civil War in 1922. He's ill, and by 1924, it's clear he's not long for this life. He writes his last will and testament, and there is a question mark as to, who's going to take over when Lenin dies. Well, another whole story is how Stalin is going to best Lenin, because Lenin did not want Stalin to be the next leader. But that's a story for a different day, because we know Stalin does become the next leader. Taken shortly before Lenin dies. So the Russian people have mostly only known authoritarianism. Here is a 19th century painting of Pugachev's rebellion, which took place during Catherine the Great, one of their uprisings against the oppression of the Tsar and their sufferings, massive killings at the hands of the Russian military. Peasants would be conscripted from time to time. This is a late 19th century photograph. Notice they're carrying pitchforks, not rifles, to go chase after some local bandits. A artist's rendering of a Siberian prison camp, which was busy from the late 1800s on, and will, of course, become busier under Stalin. So the Russian people suffered, as we see in Zhivago. And sadly, the Russian people still suffer today. Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality live on.
Thank you,
That was great.
Ken. That
that
was
was great.
great. And that does help a little bit with some of mine. Let me just jump up right here to.
That was
get
awesome.
this.
But first, are there any questions for Kendall?
Oh, okay. Oop.
Charles, did I get that for you?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I started out looking at women of the Russian Revolution, and I thought that there would be, I'd written down 5 or 6, and in the end, I narrowed it down to these 2 women that I'm going to talk about tonight, one of which was involved in the theory and politics, and the other one is involved in the military, and so you'll get 2 completely sort of different aspects of these women who had just incredible lives. So the first is, let me just get that to move up. There we go. Is Alexandra Mikhailovna Kollontai. And Alexandra was a Russian revolutionary, a politician, a diplomat, and a Marxist theoretician. She was served as the People's Commissar for Welfare in Vladimir Lenin's government in 1917 to 1918. She was a highly prominent woman within the Bolshevik Party. She was the first woman in history to be a cabinet minister, the first woman ambassador, and was also nominated for the Nobel Prize.
Oh.
Her father was a Russian general, and her mother was from a wealthy peasant family that had made a lot of money. She was not allowed to go to college. She wanted to go to college, and her mother told her to get out and get herself a husband. So sadly, in the get herself a husband, she found Vladimir Kollontai, who was an engineer, and she thought that would be a great marriage. And her mother, and this is a great quote from her mother, she thought that Kollontai was too poor and she should not marry him. And actually, they sent her away for a year so she would hopefully break it up, but she did not. But her mother said to her, "You work, you who can't even make up your own bed to look neat and tidy, you who never picked up a needle, you who go marching through the house like a princess and never help the servants with their work, you who are just like your father going around dreaming and leaving your books on every chair and table in the house." They sent her away for the year. She came back. They got married in 1893 and they had a son. Unfortunately, She really was unhappy, and she left her husband and child. She put her child with her parents and left her husband to study economics in Switzerland in 1898. A quote from her, she said, "We separated, although we were in love, because I felt trapped. I was detached from Vladimir, her husband, because of the revolutionary upsettings rooted in Russia. She started studying Marxist ideas and described herself as a Marxist revisionist." She returned to Russia in 1899 and met Lenin, and she had not yet picked a side. She offered assistance actually to both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and then became a Menshevik herself. She was a witness to the Bloody Sunday. She was there on Bloody Sunday when everybody was mowed down by the Tsar's troops. She then also went into exile in Germany in 1908 after she published a book called Finland and Socialism that actually was against Russia, trying to get into Finland. She then traveled from Denmark, who also supported the war. Now we're talking, World War I. And so she left Denmark because they were supporting war. She went to Sweden, where she was trying to express her ideas. She was arrested there for her anti-war talk. Then when she got out of jail there, she went to Norway, where she finally found a socialist community and was welcomed there. Then she went back to Russia in 1917 after the February Revolution. At 45, she married 28-year-old Pavel Dybenko. So she got herself a boy toy going back. She's 45, he's 28. That's him on the right there with her in the picture. In the right, he's on the left. Dybenko, he was a Russian revolutionary. She wrote about the need to build comradely love, contrasting this ideal with the jealous and possessive relationship that characterized the bourgeois ideal of romantic love. She argued that this type of relationship emerged with the rise of the bourgeoisie and embodied the concept of private property, which was in turn projected onto personal relationships. This reinforcement of an ingrained sense of possessiveness and entitlement in romantic relationships then became the source of multiple forms of violence. So by 1919, she was the most prominent woman in the Soviet administration. Let me go next, okay. She then went ahead and started to criticize the policies of Lenin and Trotsky. She thought she could speak up and talk about that, which probably was not a great idea. She was supposed to speak at the 11th Congress in 1922, and they canceled her speech, and she became an outcast after that contest. She then asked Stalin if she could serve abroad and was sent to Norway, first as a woman diplomat. Initially, she was sent as an attaché to the Soviet commercial mission in Norway, becoming one of the first women serving in diplomacy in modern times. In early 1924, Kollontai was first promoted to chargé d'affaires, from August to minister plenipotentiary. As such, she afterwards served in Mexico, then again in Norway, 1927 to 30 in Norway, and eventually in Sweden again from 1930 to 1945, where she was finally promoted to ambassador in 1943. She was also a member of the Soviet delegation to the League of Nations. She hoped to return to the Russian political scene. That did not happen. They did not welcome her back. In 1946 and 47, both, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Scandinavian political circles for her diplomatic efforts to end the war and hostilities between the Soviet Union and Finland during the negotiations in 1940 to 44. She died less than a month from her 80th birthday. She was the only member of the Bolshevik Central Committee that had led the October Revolution who managed to live into the 1950s, other than Stalin and his devoted supporter, Matvei Muranov. She had sometimes been criticized and even held to contempt for not raising her voice during the Stalin purges, where among countless others, her former husband, her former lover and fighting comrade, and so many of her friends were executed. As had been noted at times, she was safe in her sumptuous Stockholm residence. However, Kollontai did not enjoy full liberty of action and did have to worry about the possible fates of her family. Her only son and her nephew remarkably made it through the purges. So she was, worried about those purges and what was happening. So she sort of tolerated Stalin after speaking up with Lenin and Trotsky and getting put out. And there she is in Norway in her later years. Now, the next person is involved in the military. Maria Bakarova. She was a soldier in World War I. She was commander of the 1st Women's Battalion of Death. She visited the United States and England and had her memoir published while she was in the United States. this woman had an unbelievable, a short life. She dies at 30. She was born into a peasant family and left home at 15. She was abused by her father and two husbands. She was the third daughter of a peasant family born in Novgorod Oblast in 1889. She was badly beaten by her alcoholic father. She left home at 15 to marry Afsani Bokrava, and they moved to Tomsk in Siberia, where they worked as laborers. She was a good organizer and eventually became the foreman of 25 male workers. She was physically being abused by her husband, so she left him and found work on a steamship. And then later she married a second man, Yakov Buk, who was a butcher, and they set up a butcher shop, and then he got exiled. She followed him in exile, but he also became violent with her. So in 1914, she left him. When she left him, she went to sign up to join the 25th Regiment of the Tomsk Reserve Battalion, and they told her to go be a nurse. So she sent a telegram to Tsar Nicholas II to get permission to join the army, and he agreed. And so she had 3 months of training and then was sent to the front with the 25th Tomsk Rebellion. A quote from her: "The news of a woman recruit had preceded me at the barracks, and my arrival there precipitated a riot of fun. The men assumed that I was a loose-moraled woman who had made her way into the ranks for the sake of carrying on her illicit trade." In 1917, Kerensky encouraged her to form a women's battalion. She was wounded twice and decorated 3 times for bravery. This is her in this, whoops, where's my little thing here? Oh, wait, hold on. First of all, Sarah's joining us. Let me let her in. This is her right here next to the woman in the Red Cross outfit. She's supervising women learning how to shoot. So anyway, in 1917, she asked about forming a women's battalion. Her reasoning for this were the men were deserting the army, the Russian army, fast and furious. They'd had enough. And she thought if women formed a battalion, they would shame the men into coming back and getting to work. So Alexander Kerensky said, go ahead and form a women's battalion. So 2,000 women signed up for this. A lot of them just signing up, you know, she went around and spoke and got them going, but the actual fighting force dwindled down because of the fact that she forced them to follow her iron rules. They had to be able to do everything. And so the force was large, and then it got smaller. So over the next 3 years after she started the women's battalion, she was wounded twice during that. Russian men were I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Okay. In a speech given in June, she argued, "Come with us in the name of your fallen heroes. Come with us to dry the tears and heal the wounds of Russia. Protect her with your lives. We women are turning into tigresses to protect our children from a shameful yoke, to protect the freedom of our country." So an American woman, Bessie Beatty, who went to see women on the Eastern Front, she wrote, "Women can fight. Women have the courage and the endurance and even the strength for fighting. The Russian have demonstrated that, and if necessary, all the other women in the world can demonstrate it." Florence Farnborough, who commented on August 13th, 1970, said, "At dinner, we heard more of the Women's Death Battalion." By the way, the Death Battalion, you could call any unit a death battalion. All it meant was you would fight and never surrender. So any group could name themselves a death battalion as long as they were going to fight and never surrender. So it was true. Bakareva had brought her small battalion down to south of the Austrian front, and they had manned part of the trenches, which had been abandoned by the Russian infantry. The size of the battalion was considerably decreased from original numbers. Many of them, painted and powdered, had joined the battalion as an exciting and romantic adventure. She loudly condemned their behavior and demanded iron discipline. Gradually, the patriotism and enthusiasm spent itself till she was down to about 250. In honor to those women volunteers, it was recorded that they did go into the attack. They did go over the top, but not all of them. Some remained in the trenches, fainting and hysterical. Others ran or crawled back to the rear. In October, 25th of October, Bakareva and the few remaining members of her women's battalion attempted to defend the Winter Palace against Bolshevik forces. There's some controversy on this too. Some say that they were not, her troops were not there, that it was another woman's troops, but there are also people who say she was there defending the Winter Palace against the Bolshevik forces. John Reed, an American journalist in Petrograd during the revolution, reported that all sorts of sensational stories were published in the anti-Bolshevik press and told in the city Duma about the fate of the women's battalion defending the palace. It was said that some of the girl soldiers had been thrown from windows into the street. and most of them had been violated, and many had committed suicide as a result of the horrors they had gone through. The Duma ended up appointing a committee to investigate that claims of ill treatment. And what happened next was they found that
cash only.
however, he claimed that no women had been thrown out of windows of the Winter Palace, that there were women who had been violated, and one had committed suicide. So on November 21st of 1917, the Bolshevik Military Revolutionary Committee officially dissolved the Women's Battalion. So when they dissolved that battalion, Maria flew the country, and she was funded by Florence Harriman, who lived in San Francisco, traveled to New York and Washington, where she met with politicians. This included President Woodrow Wilson, who promised to do all he could to defeat the Bolshevik government. Apparently, she pleaded with him, and he was brought to tears by her pleas. While in America, she dictated her memoirs called Yashka, My Life as a Peasant, Exile, and Soldier, to Isaac Don Levine. And then she traveled to London, where she was granted an audience with King George V. She also met members of the British government, and it was agreed to pay for her return to the White Army-controlled Russia. Attempts to form another women's battalion ended in failure. In 1919, she moved to Tomsk and served under Alexander Kolchak. Later that year, she was captured by the troops led by Mahenko and Frunz, Bolshevik troops. She was sent to Krasnoyarsk, where she was interrogated by the Bolsheviks, and then she was executed by the Cheka, which was like the secret police at that time, returned and was put in front of a firing squad, and she was shot on May 16th of 1920. So after looking at all this, I said to myself, I have lived a very boring life. These people have done unbelievable things. I just shoot up here the questions for this week, but I can bring that down. We can sort of jump in wherever with that. I'm going to stop the share. These two women's lives were one living into her 80s and the other one dying at 30, certainly had done incredible things in Russia. So on to our discussion. Peter, take it away. I know we've taken up some time here to get on with our discussion.
Okay. I noticed that Sarah David, who was in Thailand, has
Yes,
joined.
hello. Good to be
Is
here.
it like
Good
White
to see
Lotus? Are you at the
I'm
White
driving.
Lotus?
I didn't watch the White Lotus. No, I didn't. I should though, before I go down to Phuket in the islands where I guess it all takes place.
Wow.
Sorry, I might not have caught some earlier things. I'm on the road right now, driving to Chiang Mai. It's a beautiful
cool.
morning here. Good to see everybody.
Great.
Great to see you, and don't, like, keep in mind that you're driving. Don't get crazy, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I'll be careful.
All right. All right. Okay. Well, Kendall and Ginny just, gave us a hell of a lot of interesting information. I guess, since we're somewhat limited in time, I'm wondering how much you folks make the connection between the events of Dr. Zhivago and what we learned tonight from Ginny and Kendall.
I think it's the first question, Doc,
Yeah.
about the train.
Yes.
It's almost like the train ride Kendall and Ginny took us through is what the train's a metaphor for. All the changes, like politically, like the train's, I mean, it's cheesy, but right, the train's a metaphor for it.
Yeah, well, what's cheesy?
No, it's like, because I could be wrong. I don't know. I mean, it seems like that, that train ride, you're dealing with, that there's classes of people, you're dealing with people's thoughts, you're dealing with the revolution. So I don't know.
But it's likely something that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm just giving you a hard time.
I
I
know.
mean, you know that. Okay, good.
I'll save you there, Ethan. Let Doc, pick on me for a little bit. I just, I look at trains and their tracks almost as a timeline across so many various segments, as what Kendall brought up about, this section of the country and that forces were coming from so many areas. but part of my confusion with the names and the places, it sure feels like everybody's confused at that time, and it changes over time. Are you a red? Are you a white? Are you a Bolshevik? Are you? It just adds so much to the craziness that everybody's trying to go through. And yes, where you start at these great parties, and then a few years later, you're scrambling for wood, taking apart it was a chest of drawers or something.
Yeah.
It's just or debating whether to take those chest of drawers apart.
Yeah,
It's
that's
just
a really interesting thing that you said there, Greg, because I think that one of the criticisms against the novel is that it is, in a sense, confused. But I think, as you've stated quite well, there's an argument to be said that there was such great confusion in the Russia of that time, when people were in fact traveling east, trying to escape Moscow, and having just a real sort of combo platter of people in the trains,
just
going, yes,
all
like,
shoulder to shoulder. Yeah.
that it actually kind of makes sense that there should be some chaos. There should be, because yeah, that's the way people were feeling at the time. Yeah, good point.
It also gave you the perspective of the geography and the destruction that occurred in the towns, the difficulties with food and survival, the way the train system was working and shuttling. I think it gave a very good picture of the totality of the effect. Also, the difference between Moscow and the countryside.
Yeah, that's really good, Charles. So what did you take from that reality that you were becoming aware of as the train moved? I mean, you'd mentioned that there were stops in the countryside. There were, ultimately, they get to Uriatin, right? But within that journey, what do you find, or I mean, it's done this to everybody, but what do you find that was most compelling, that kind of taught you the most, that maybe you weren't even expecting?
Well, the hardships of the people, the lack of food, the fact you had to get the passengers off to clear the tracks and clear the snow and get the train moving again. It just was a total lack of support for the people.
Okay,
I thought it was interesting in the clearing of the tracks that they separated everybody by who they were. Like one group wasn't allowed to shovel with another group, and they kept the one drift in the middle between them till the very end. Because it was interesting, I think Zhivago's choice to put them in the car, like they had said how like the military was in the front, and then it was people who could afford a seat, and then it was sort of mixed cars, that he put him in a mixed car. So they were some slave labor, some peasants, some people with money. They had a nice assortment in there, so they got to talk to a lot of different people and hear about different things as they traveled. But I thought it was interesting when they got out to shovel, which they said was like the happiest part of their thing, was being out every day shoveling snow, that they kept them separated, the groups that shoveled. I thought that was very interesting.
Other comments about that?
I think it shows, like you had mentioned in the background, the Soviet, or I guess the Bolshevik control of the railways. And I think that's pretty evident in the story, because as they're going, they kind of see in the distance the burning cities along the railway that had, I guess, been hit by, I guess, Strelnikov. Yeah, Strelnikov. So they could kind of see it, but there wasn't like the fighting that you were seeing in the front. It was all kind of in the periphery, like in the corner, almost like you don't see it if you're looking straight forward. It's always kind of in the background or like right out of the corner of your eye is all of the fighting. But it just seems like the Reds do have that control, like when they stop at the stations, and of course he gets picked up and pulled into the train car with like the Red Army component and all of that stuff. But there doesn't seem to be any kind of white presence or stronghold that's as direct.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really good. Other comments?
um the dialectics or whatever, the Hegel
Yes.
philosophy that kind of started it all, um is very confusing because there is no end to it, and
Mm,
that makes complete absolute sense to me. Actually, I think that's my philosophy. um and then like the on the train, yeah, you have all this like all the mix up and the confusion and the separation, but it's not really separate. And then you have Strelnikov, who has this personality and this renown, and everyone knows Strelnikov. And then, he gets pulled in to meet him, and he's like, huh, okay, this guy isn't what I expected at all, and I'm still alive, and there's no trouble. And then you find out who he actually is, and that's even more um uh
Hi
like
there.
makes sense because
My name's called Clara.
Clara,
Yeah.
um,
Hey.
because he didn't even join the army to join the army. He joined it to escape his life. So it's like, how did he become this very important person in this violent party? And he's not even like, and then outside of that, when they're in the town, and he like doesn't talk to his family, and he's very private. It was such an interesting, the end, the beginning of that section, I was like, ugh, this is so boring. But towards the end, it got a little bit more exciting for me.
There was a part of that actually. I want to say it was when they were talking about him that kind of struck me, and I can't remember the page or what the words that he specifically used, but in my head it's like nobody is a caricature. Like everybody, it's almost like the was it the women? Do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself. I contain
Yeah,
multitudes because
yeah, yeah.
nobody is. He even talks about it, and there's a passage in it about how everybody is not really what you would expect them to be
Yes.
specifically, that they're different and they're unique and they're not one dimensional. And I think that really plays out where you've got, Yuri and Lara, who kind of are playing both sides in a sense, because Lara is explicitly tied to Stranikov, and also explicitly tied to Galyulin. And everybody knows it, but nobody kind of calls them out. And the one guy that they meet on the train who knows everybody in Yuryatin, who can somehow get whatever he wants, and he's
Yes.
but he'll make money, but there's no contradiction in that. It's cool to be a capitalist and a socialist at the same time. It's all good. And how everybody is complicated. That's what I took out of that passage. I wish I had highlighted it, but that struck me.
Well, I mean, you bring up Strelnikov, who I think is, to me, a very interesting character, because we know who he is, right? We know he was Pasha, the teacher, and we know that he was a very influential teacher, um, and yet, and we also know of his father's background. So it's not hard to understand why he becomes what he becomes. But what would you say that Pasternak's attitude is towards, because Strelnikov's is a big deal, right? Strelnikov is the kind of the symbolic figure of the revolution, right? I mean, he's the Bolsheviks.
Kendall wants to say, go ahead,
Can I
Kendall.
throw some in there? Precede your question there, Doc, but it relates to that too. There are several really good collections of accounts of individuals who survived the Civil War, who survived the purges, who survived the Soviet Union, and to a T, in their own individual ways, Russians did what they had to do to survive, and they would do anything, support anyone in order to survive, versus the idealists who, for the most part, always died.
Yeah. So how does Strelnikov operate in these pages? I mean, we have Yuri meeting him. We have lots of references to him. You know, it's kind of a mythic figure. But that said, how does Pasternak seem to deal with him? Remember, I mean, this book was banned, right, in the Soviet Union, and you know, part of the reason was the way that Pasternak dealt with the figures of the revolution. But I wonder how you sort of interpreted Strelnikov's role, you know, vis-a-vis what Kendall just said about, you know, he's a survivor, okay, but
I think more than that, he's turned into like not necessarily robotic, but he's abandoned all of his past everything and he's going towards what he thinks is the prize and he's willing to sacrifice everything for it. That's what it looks like to me.
But he also projects an image that influences people directly by his appearance, by his demeanor. He also shows some compassion with Zhivago, and again with the child who had the head wound, about taking care of him. So he has some nice properties to him.
And Peter, answering your question about the view of Strelnikov, I take into account the people that Strelnikov surrounded him. The guard who drags his gun, you know, that sounds like a weird person to have, you know, right in there. And then he criticizes the incompetence of the guy that they were looking for when they captured Yuri. And apparently the description isn't anywhere, you know, close the same. So he may just be a little bit of order in all of this crazy incompetence around him. And that may, in fact, be all that it took for him to rise at least at that stage.
And maybe this is just another, that's a good point that Greg brought up, is maybe it's just another one of these interesting coincidences that Pasternak puts in the novel that, hey, we thought you were some guy that we were looking for. You end up being Yuri that he knows from back in the day. And then there's some like aha moments there all over the place, kind of full circle.
But he doesn't reveal them to anybody else, which intrigued me, that he said, well, let's go over here to talk, so that no one else would, you know, make that connection, which I think was kind of foreboding what's coming in the future.
I think
I do think it was good.
I was just it's clear that where I kind of saw analogs to historical figures was like his charisma modifier is clearly off the charts, because like the people that had him as a teacher remember him as the best teacher they ever had. The people that had him in as a military leader saw him as this large, you know, he takes a pseudonym, he divorces himself from who he was. He becomes this larger than life character that inspires people in spite of, I mean, his name means the executioner. Like he's clearly cool with like rampant murder. But people still love him because of that. And I think that can clearly be applied to a lot of, I guess, demagogues in the 20th century, many of whom were in Russia at the time, where like, despite what they do, people still followed them, loved them, listened to them. Just, they had that, you know, that presence.
You know, that's kind of where I was going with the question, because you know, by mentioning, okay, so the book was banned, but a character like Strelnikov, he's not a simple character, as Greg pointed out, and there are elements. Yes, I mean, clearly he they pass the villages where Strelnikov has, exerted, his power over villages that were not, that did not conform to, the Bolshevik demands. But that said, he's still, I think to me he's one of the more interesting characters because like you think think like oh boy he's a baddie, but then you start understanding why he did what he did, and then you see him, whoa, he's very cruel, but he's actually very dedicated to his cause. And then you say, well, wait a minute, what the hell is he doing leaving his wife and child?
I think some of it is to impress them also. I think that's some of his pursuit as well. So he's abandoned, and a great word, divorce, like Rachel said, his past life and all those, but he may be doing it because he didn't feel adequate enough in front of Laura and everyone else. And that's where he's kind of going towards it for his own kind of journey rather than just for what he believes in, as far as the Bolsheviks go.
I think too, he tries to put everything else aside to follow the cause. And that's what makes him different. When they have the confrontation with he and Yuri says, I don't have to justify myself to you. I've spent a lot of my life thinking about how I should be. And he obviously has the cause of being a Bolshevik and that he's going to do whatever it takes. And he's attacking the very town where his wife and daughter live relentlessly with no real thought for them. And they also are wondering why, as Laura said, like you couldn't come once to see us, stop in here or whatever. But it's interesting because I see the train ride as a whole to put them all on a collision course. Because like when Yuri doesn't want to go to Yuriatin to very, because he knows that's where Laura is out there. That's where she's living. That's where Strelnikov is, and things going in. So that train ride puts them all on a collision course right into the same neck of the woods where they can't help but run into each other because they're in the same area. But I think you admire Strelnikov because he has a sense of purpose and he's going to stick with it. And he even says, when this is done, when I've done my job, I will see my wife and daughter.
Yes.
But not before. And he's willing to put all that aside. Whereas Yuri just wants to be with his wife and child and live life. And I think that's a lot of it too, is when he talks about Pushkin quite a bit, the idea of, do we live day to day and take joy in that? Or do we live thinking about all the great and big issues in life? And what does life mean and all of that? I thought that was sort of an interesting part of that section.
Yes. Yeah.
Is his use of a pseudonym like supposed to be reminiscent of Lenin and Stalin, like Ulyanov and Zhugashvili and like Strelnikov instead of Antipov?
I don't know. That's a good question.
You mean the author or the character?
Well, like, so both Lenin and Stalin, like that wasn't their names. Like they took different names as they became leaders. So I was
I think
wondering,
in
like, either
in
a
this
decision
story,
that
he just wants to be anonymous. He doesn't want to be connected to his family. I think he wants his family. Like, didn't he leave? He left he left the family because he was like overwhelmed. He wanted to didn't he leave them originally? Like, because he was like, oh, I gotta get away from here. Like, I need a break from all this.
But you don't take the name the executioner if you're just getting away from family.
Hi
Like,
there.
you're-
I know, but I feel like that's I feel like that's an author thing, like not a character thing.
Or the illustrator.
Like I think if the character picked a name, he would have just picked any old name.
Or the illustrator.
Especially because he was, again, like he left not to because he was passionate about the cause, but to get away. And on page 294, it has like it has Zhivago's when he first meets him, his whole like impression of him. And just before he goes into his impression, there's this line when he sees the boy with the wounded head. And he says he wanted to cry out both to the boy and to the people in the car that salvation lay not in faithfulness to forms, but in liberation from them. Wow.
Good. That's really good.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that Strelnikov is a good example, really, of how, in a way, balanced the novel is. That it's, yes, okay, sure. Who do we? You always favor. You're always looking for the advancement of the two lovers, right? I mean, like, who the hell doesn't do that, right? But by the same token, it seems to me that there's a measure of quite a big measure of objectivity in the way that that Pasternak views his characters. I mean, to me, he's very good at showing both sides, negative, positive elements of his characters, and I think in a larger sense, he shows both sides of the revolution. He shows both sides of the of what it means to be, to remain loyal to the whites, what it means to be, what it means to be one with Strelnikov. And I think in Strelnikov you have the kind of crystallization of the overall approach that Pasternak takes.
And
And
that
even though,
becomes,
yes,
and that becomes the reason why the books was banned there, because it shows both sides, as
yes,
opposed to just
okay, yeah,
just the one.
yeah, precisely. It's not an acceptable text for the
Right, but that brings in Rachel's points of like why people are named certain things. I mean, it's basically Kendall and Ginny's history discussion in a narrative form, trying to be tongue in cheek, and therefore, as Charles said, it's banned.
yeah. Well, it looks like we're sort of nearing the end.
One quick comment.
You
You
go
didn't
ahead.
sing,
Go ahead.
Doc. I
Remember,
thought you were gonna sing.
Just the way it was
I
written.
can't. I told you I cannot sing because I have sciatica today. I'll
Just
do
want to
my
say that
best next year. I've
Conveniently out of time, you're saying. Conveniently out of time for class for singing.
not. No, I resent that. I think that the point is I play it in A. It's in the key of A. Lara's theme. Anybody who wants to join along, okay, so for next week, I'm sending you the lyrics. So I'm expecting total, if somebody doesn't sing, you're out.
Poor Charles is trying to make a point here.
I
a
understand
minor
this.
point, though. Pasternak was being very nice to us in that he puts in characters who move the story along and tell us the story in an area, rather than
Yes.
having two characters or multiple characters say it slowly. They just come out and give you the text and say, this is what happened here, and went through
Yes.
100 pages. So thank him for that.
Good point. Excellent point. Okay. Any last words?
It was excellent.
We'll get more to the text next week.
I've never read the book or seen the movie, so this was a cliffhanger for me where we stopped.
The movie is worth it. I mean, it really is.
It's funny. I just watched the movie the other day, and I wish I hadn't. Although it's very good with the train scene, because they change a lot of stuff. But when he gets swept off the road where we left off, and
Yes.
suddenly all that's left is his little hat laying in the middle of the road in the snow cover, and they just say, "You're coming," and off he goes, right in the middle of between telling Laura, "I can't do this. My wife's gonna have a baby." I mean, it couldn't have been more than it was such a cliffhanger as we stopped. And then in the movie, it's equally
Yeah,
sort
it
of an
is.
exciting scene there where you're suddenly like, what? Now, just when we thought everything was going to get straightened out, it's going down.
Yeah.
But the movie leaves out so much.
So much. And it changes, but Strelnikov is
Well, it
very
has
different
to.
in the
I mean,
movie.
it
Yeah.
has to.
Yeah, there's no, I can't see any alternative unless you made
No.
it, you know, a
They couldn't fit them
5-part
all in there.
series.
Yes, exactly. It would
One-
have to be a series. Yeah.
There is a
But they have some
series.
cool
There is a
stuff that I,
series, yeah, which I have not seen. Have you
Is
seen
it
that?
like
It's good.
Keira Knightley? Is it Keira Knightley or someone? It's
It is.
someone.
Kira Light.
Keira Knightley is in it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's
they did
For
a new
our
version
next-
of it.
For our
yeah, it's
next
like
session,
2000
we can
something.
act out the book
Wow.
recorded.
No, I mean,
I will look that up.
I'm
One
a
film
big
part of it
question.
and show you
I'm a
something.
big Keira Knightley fan. I mean, this is bad. I mean, it's like Julie Christie, Keira Knightley. It's
There's actually 2 series available.
geez, what
Okay.
There's one earlier than that,
There's the
too,
movies,
which I have not
and-
seen.
Yeah, there's a movie, then the 90s series, and then the 2000 and change or whatever of Kira and stuff. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Okay,
I didn't
wow.
know there were other ones. Yikes.
There's a couple.
I
And
haven't
I
seen
wonder
that
if
either.
they've got to include more of the details, right? I
It
mean,
does. The Nightly does, yes.
Yeah, I think the movie, it was too hard to fit everything in, and they changed some of the things that happened. Just made, I have to say, reading this section, the one thing they did in the movie that I thought was really cool was the cart ride from the station with the horse with its foal with it. And
Yeah.
they do that in the movie. The foal is running with them and going back and forth to the mom and everything. And it was really cool because I had just seen that, and then there was the whole description in the book of that
Yeah.
of the foal following the mom, that they, the mayor had to work, but the foal was going to play and come along with it.
Yeah.
And they were going through, the countryside. It was really very well done. David Lean was big on the,
No,
big
I mean,
epic movies like
God did what he could. I mean,
It's
right?
it's a beautiful movie.
it
it
is.
is.
It's beautiful to watch. It's a lot of, the scenery and everything. Varikino is very cool when they go there in the winter. I always like,
Just a little bit of snow there.
yeah,
Yeah,
a little bit
really.
of snow and a little bit of cold.
Thank
Well, one question, and I didn't see it in the YouTube videos. Thank you once again for posting those. In the translations, have any of you who've done more of the research found different things in the translations that were significant, or is it pretty consistent?
Interesting that you mentioned it, Greg, because I was reading about the translations the other day, and the most recent translation was published fairly recently, and that is, oh God, no. I mean, I think it's either his grandson or it's a Pasternak who has done the translation. The criticism of the translation that we're reading, which is the second major translation in English, is that the translators are they're compelled to create the language exactly as Pasternak wrote it, but not necessarily to include the kind of figurative elements that he did. In other words, they just weren't, they were going for as literal a translation as possible. The first were criticized because they added all kinds of, in other words, they took a very creative role in translating. It wasn't very, it wasn't very really accurate.
It's
Okay.
bound to happen with some people doing it, and that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, and
Like,
I think
kind of funny story about like that dynamic. Like,
Yeah.
give me 30 seconds. When I was living in Russia, I was teaching English, and one of the things that we would do. So, what did you do over the weekend so that people, to get conversationally, and with the adult students, especially the college age folks, they'd always say, "I walked." What'd you do? I walked, and that just seemed really strange. It didn't make sense because that was the translation. It was yagulyala, like I walked. And it wasn't until I found a friend that had lived there for a long time that was able to actually do the translation, what it meant when kids were doing that. If they'd say that it was kind of like bar hopping, but it was going from like they had the outdoor kiosks that sell alcohol like on corners. So they were walking from kiosk to corner to kiosk to corner, like getting trashed with their friends. But the
Okay.
word for that was to walk. So like if you were to actually translate it literally, which is what they were doing because they didn't know that, you would say, well, I walked around the neighborhood. But if you actually understood the spirit and the zeitgeist of the word, you'd say we went bar hopping because that's essentially what it was. So like the literal versus the, I guess, philosophical. It was a funny realization once that made sense because then everyone walking all weekend made, like, oh, okay, you were partying. That makes a lot more sense.
Rachel,
Yeah.
it's also like slang and certain things. Like my kids now have their terms. We at Gen X had our terms, and it's when I went to Russia, like you were teaching, I was just there as a student talking to other kids, and just translating things was tough. Of like just U.S. language from the early '90s and theirs, and yeah, I mean, it's what like Greg said. Any language, any translation, you're going to get nuance. It was just interesting because we translate, we're talking, and I mean, it's just translating things. It
I
happens.
have to be very careful when I talk about a bar crawl to friends who aren't used to, living in America in the future now that based on Rachel's story. Thank you.
I think you're on your hands and knees already, Greg. Your bar crawl.
Idioms are for the birds.
Lee, did you have something to say?
I was just gonna say that I started reading a different version of the book before I got the right one, and I was trying to figure out
Right.
where I was, and it was so different. It was so different.
Was
Like,
was it the first one? The one that like I probably first read, is it the Max Hayward?
let me look. But like it one of the like I figured it out finally, and I was like, what's different here? And like instead of buildings in our book, it was houses. And there was like a part where it was like saying drop, 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 I think, in our book. And it like had some other, like, I don't even think it had anything like that.
Lee, what you just said real quick, that's artistic, like what Doc was saying of nuance or not, because house is dome and building is something like that's where people are like, okay, well, yeah, that's interesting.
um,
Oh, well.
it doesn't say actually. Because I got it off of my Hoopla um thing, but this is what it looks
What does
like.
it look like?
Wait, oh, hold on, let me turn off my blurry. Let
Yeah,
me see.
that's the first one. That's by the
Wait. Why isn't it working? That's weird. Okay,
I'm gonna throw up now.
okay.
Ooh, 3D.
Yeah.
I don't know how to should do it anyway.
Don't
Yeah.
worry. But what you have there is you've been looking at that you were looking at the first translation, the first English translation. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
very art right. More
and I
creative.
had, because that's the one I read first, in my Russian lit class, and that, so I set it aside, and I guess the essential story is not changed, but definitely the degree of sort of artistic license is pretty clear when you look at the first translation and then the one that we're reading, which is really a lot. They're not really going to be suggesting bar hopping in the translation we're doing. What they're going to be talking about is walking on the weekend, right? And then we have to kind of, extrapolate what that might mean. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, gang. Well, we've had a good time again. So we'll see you next week.